I reckon. Let's get back to some of the campaign issues, the federal election campaign issues, and I'm joined by Stephen Galilee from the New South Wales Minerals Council. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. Look, we'll get to your industry in just a moment, but I just had a flashback. I reckon in the 2007 campaign, weren't you on the campaign trail with John Howard as he's trying to hang on to government, dealing with all these issues? Give us an insight. What's it like crisscrossing the country, trying to work out where your limited time can be best spent?
Well, it was great to be with the greatest campaigner of all time. And at this stage of the campaign, you're probably just thinking there's 4 more sleeps to go, Chris, as you would know.
Yeah. What about John Howard's intervention in the campaign yesterday? He was out. We're expecting him actually to speak in Perth today with Liberal Minister Ken Wyatt, but he bobbed up with Tony Abbott yesterday, and like the old master, straight away come out with a couple of lines that really cut to the quick.
He's still got it, hasn't he? I mean, they should find a seat for him, and I'm sure he'd win in a landslide.
Absolutely. Now, tell me about the Minerals Council and what your concerns would be about this election. Obviously, Adani is a major issue, but that doesn't affect New South Wales. What would the impact of blocking a mine like that be on the minerals sector more broadly across the country?
Well, it does send a bad signal about Australia's openness for investment. It sends a bad signal generally across the coal sector nationally. Here in New South Wales, I know at the recent state election, which we were watching very closely from a New South Wales Minerals Council perspective, there was a lot of nervousness and anxious amongst the coal miners that I spoke to about whether or not that, they were confident that the Labor Party really was looking after their interests. And that's something that I think the Labor Party are trying to address through some advertising in those hunter mining regions that I've noticed as well. But there is a feeling across many parts of the coal sector, right down to the people that are literally working at the coalface, that their interests aren't being represented anymore by the political parties that used to.
Yeah, look, I was watching Greens leader Richard Di Natale last night rant on, as he tends to do, against coal and criticise Scott Morrison for the time he brought a lump of coal into Parliament, talking about coal as though it's kryptonite. Now, of course, if people want to argue about climate change and argue sensible policies and transitions to other fuels over time, that's fine and that's sensible. But to completely decry and demonise this sector, the coal mining sector and coal electricity, completely flies in the face of reality, especially in a year when it's actually reclaimed its place as the #1 export of this nation.
Well, sadly what it does, Chris, it alienates here in New South Wales over 40,000 coal mining workers and their families from the political process. It also means we can't have a rational and logical debate about our energy needs on a technology-neutral basis, because what are deemed to be politically incorrect options, such as coal-fired power and nuclear power, are essentially ruled out. They're shouted out of the debate and they're shouted out of consideration. And that's something that we're very concerned about as an industry. We support a technology-neutral approach, but what we're finding is that it's very difficult to have a sensible discussion about our future energy needs because of those issues.
Now, tell us about the energy needs in New South Wales. Speaking of coal, of course, the Liddell power station is slated to shut down in only about 3 years' time. And AEMO has already warned that when that shuts down, not only will there be increased upward pressure on electricity prices, but the supply will be further jeopardised in this state, and because of the national market elsewhere as well. Does something need to be done there more urgently as we approach the closure of that station?
Well, we've been warning about this for well over a year now. In 2022, when Liddell is scheduled to close, New South Wales is going to go through its version of what South Australia and Victoria have been through in past years. We're going to lose a significant proportion of our generation capacity. There are no concrete plans in place from what we can see to replace that capacity. AGL, the owner of the plant, they made some commitments and promised some feasibility studies last year. They have recently been backing away from those commitments and those studies. Renewable energy projects are proposed to meet some of that capacity shortfall, but it's unclear whether they will all proceed. And of course we know that renewable energy is still not yet at the technology level where it can replace that baseload power with storage.
What Labor is taking to this campaign with a 50% renewable energy target, when we think of the turmoil and dislocation and difficulties that have been created by the renewable energy target already, to more than double it by 2030, and of course to almost double the emissions reductions cuts. So surely you must think that in your industry, both in terms of export and in terms of those domestic energy needs, there's going to be much more turmoil over the next decade if those policies are put in place. We haven't had them quantified, we haven't had a hell of a lot of detail, but we do know that to reach those targets there's going to be an enormous amount of change.
Well, there's change happening already as we move towards meeting our Paris Agreement commitments as a country, and our industry supports that. And it's true that those higher commitments, they haven't been costed. We don't know the full impact, but we do know they're going to cause a massive amount of dislocation and economic cost. And generally, I think that the public, Chris, as you know, if they hear a policy that's got a higher target or it sounds a bit more extreme, they instinctively know that the cost is going to be higher, and most people, based on their own experience, know that they're the ones that are going to pay that cost too. So it is an issue that I think is in people's minds, and here in New South Wales, the next state election is due in 2022, the next is 2023, the next federal election would potentially be due about then too. Whoever wins this election on Saturday and the recently elected New South Wales government are potentially going to the next round of elections with some serious energy policy issues.
Well, we've seen in South Australia, of course, in the lead-up to the election, in the summer before their last election, which, of course, the Labor Party lost. But in the summer before that, in order to get through the pre-election period and make sure they didn't run out of power in that summer, they had to spend $500 million on portable gas-fired generators and the like, and that's still in place and was needed last summer. Is that sort of emergency installation a possibility for New South Wales as well?
Sadly, I think it is. I mean, the regulators were warning in March last year that if Liddell shuts and the generation capacity wasn't basically confirmed by the end of last year, New South Wales was going to have to take some action of its own. We saw in South Australia, as you correctly say, portable generators, including diesel generators, the most polluting potentially of all energy generation, being brought in to meet the shortfall. We've seen warnings over the last summer of supply and demand being so tight and potentially an over demand, a lack of supply, where we are basically as a country paying major electricity users to shut down during those periods, effectively like a third world economy. The warnings are there, Chris, and action is needed. It's almost past the point of urgent action in relation to the Liddell closure, and it is a big concern for major energy users, which include our industry, the manufacturing industry, parts of the agricultural sector, the steelworks and those sorts of high-intensity energy industries that are nervously looking to the future, having seen what's happened in other states in the past.
Stephen Galilee, this is such important stuff. This gets to just the functioning of our economy day in, day out, the employment of people. It comes to our cost of living and our international competitiveness, the very ability to have power when we need it. I write about it and talk about it quite a bit. I'm dismissed as being some sort of obsessive on the issue. On the other side of the debate, we constantly have this sort of feel-good pronouncements. Bill Shorten saying, doesn't matter what his policies cost, the cost of inaction is worse. It's an absurd statement. Very little pressure in the public, even in an election campaign, public pressure to come out with more detail. A lot of emotion and not a lot of facts. Does it concern you, the level of, I suppose, almost disregard for these critical issues in the public debate?
It is a big concern, Chris, and I liken it to one of the greatest TV shows of all time, Seinfeld, when Kramer had to wear the AIDS ribbon to show that he supported the cause. It wasn't enough for him to walk in the AIDS walk and support the cause. He had to wear a ribbon as well, and it seems these days if you're not wearing the ribbon, so to speak, on climate change, you're shouted down by others. It is a big concern for most of our major energy users here in New South Wales that we can't have a sensible debate on these issues with a view to the outcome, which is to reduce emissions and provide affordable and reliable energy.
You must have some idea of the costs of what Bill Shorten has proposed. We've had some modelling out from Brian Fisher that Labor has decried. We've had Warwick McGibbon, who's put forward some costings based on earlier policies, but it gives some indication of a cost differential, which he says is not as great. What are the variability? And no one can be certain. Of course, you're talking about modelling. But, you know, from best case scenario to worst case scenario, how difficult or how easy could it be for this country to go to 50% renewables, for instance?
Well, if you put an additional cost on the major corporations, or as they're sometimes called, the evil polluters, the ones that employ a lot of people and generate a lot of Australia's wealth, I mean, that cost is going to get passed on to the public, it's going to get passed on to consumers. And if you need to overhaul your electricity system, if you need to overhaul your transmission system and introduce new technology, that comes at a significant cost into the billions as well. That's paid by electricity users and taxpayers, the people of Australia. These issues are not without cost. You can't pretend, like some of our politicians do, that it's only the evil polluters, so to speak, that will pay. We will all pay for this. We will all pay for this. We're paying for it now. We've seen the prices impact as we move to the Paris Agreement commitments now. So there's a cost already that we're paying, and we as a nation have taken a decision that that's a cost that we should pay to make our contribution. But the idea that somehow we need to go over and above that contribution as one of the greatest virtue signals of all time is a worrying one for many people living in the real world and the real economy, in my view.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining us, Stephen. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
Stephen Galilee, who is the CEO of the New South Wales Minerals Council. I think this is such a worry. I know you do too. We talk about it often. It is such a worry. No one's pretending that the current policies under the coalition government have been brilliant. They are a mess, and we've seen constant efforts by them to try and repair the situation. They're still trying to do that. Of course, we're paying too much for our electricity. But what Labor is proposing, we don't know how much it will cost. They won't tell us how much it will cost. The one thing we know is that it will cost more and it will do more economic harm. I guess the only way to find out is to vote Labor, put them in government, see how we're looking in 3 years' time. Back after the break.
You're watching The Kenny Report on Australia's election channel.
This election, I'm voting for me. I'm voting to keep my penalty rates because I need them to put myself through uni.
I'm voting for me too.